2, 10, 2, 2, 2. Test, 1, 2, 3, 2, 10, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. Aici am semnal. Ok.
Bună ziua! Bine ați venit la evenimentul nostru de astăzi. Salut! Interesant setting-ul. Cred că o să schimb în engleză imediat, dar pentru că suntem în Parlamentul României, la început am să vorbesc în română. I will switch immediately to English. Setting-ul este oarecum este interesant pentru astfel de conferință, dar sunt sigur să ne descurcăm. The conference name, The Effects of the Current Overlapping Crisis on the Global and Romanian Economy. I just want to welcome you all here today in the Romanian Parliament. I wish you that we have a great conference, and I'm sure the topics, as you know, are still developing as we're here. I want to introduce you our two distinguished guests, then I'll give Mr. Boucher the floor. So we have Mr. Lawrence Reed here on my left. Sir, welcome. And Ms. Chris Lingle on my right. So, Mr. Boucher, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I will just give a short introduction in the topic, and then I'll introduce you the speakers. The Free Market Roadshow is actually offered by the Austrian Economic Center in cooperation with hundreds of think tanks and universities in Europe and Asia, and other institutional partners. The Free Market Roadshow is hosted today by the Senate of Romania, and we'll try to have a platform of researchers, business people, policy experts to try to discuss solutions of today's most pressing issues, starting from individual freedom, democracy, monetary policy, innovation, trade and supply chains, sustainability, geopolitics, nowadays crisis, and several other subjects will be approached. The Austrian Economic Center, which has Dr. Barbara Kolm as founder, actually, I'll try to quote her, saying that 2 years in and the measures to fight COVID-19 have led to a crisis composed of a bundle of economic, social, and health problems, mixed with a new understanding of governance. Individual and entrepreneurial rights have been eroded. Nationalistic and paternalistic approaches to businesses, trade, and production, not least of medical supplies, were all of a sudden acceptable. Vaccines have brought some reprieve, but lockdowns are still common, and we are far from returning to our normal way of life. Barbara is in Austria, so for them, kind of restrictions are still in place. Our topic today, the effects of the current overlapping crisis on the global and Romanian economy, we'll try to approach different angles. There are several topics and crises that can be talked about. There are several points of approach on those, let's say, global problems that we are all facing nowadays. Starting from, let's say, government's approaches on the economic problems, and that's globally, it's generally speaking. Most of governments try to approach the problems and the crisis in a non-libertarian way. The free market is, in a lot of countries, encouraged only at declarative level, but no appropriate measures are sometimes taken. Starting from taxation and public expenditure, sometimes countries declare that they will try to do a more free market approach, but unfortunately, just a few steps are taken on that side. There have been a lot of talks regarding quantitative easing and helicopter money as a solution for economic crisis, but from the free market point of view, that approach is probably the wrong approach, starting at the beginning from an approach in which everybody presumes that the interest rates will decline. Monetary expansion and inflation, I would say it's another type of crisis that several countries in the world are meeting, and the solution to this problem is never going to be using fiat currency or creating money out of thin air, like most of the countries do. In the last weeks or months, there are several other crises that emerged. The Ukrainian war, which is not actually just a regional conflict. It has effects on the whole global economy. All the countries in the world are affected by this war, not only by the humanitarian approach, but also the economic implications. That came together as a package with the energy crisis that is mainly hitting Europe, let's say. The European dependency of Russian gas and oil should be probably regulated, but not by rules and laws, but maybe by free market and access to free market. Another point of approaching today's crisis is the supposition that the US dollar supremacy will end, and there will be the rise of the Chinese currency as a reserve currency, which is a debatable point of view, and probably in time we'll see if that will happen. Our first speaker is actually the president of the Romanian Senate, Mr. Florin Câțu. He's an economist with professional experience, starting with experience in the United States, New Zealand, Luxembourg, and Romania. He worked for the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, where he specialized in macroeconomic modeling. He joined the European Investment Bank afterwards, and since he returned in Romania in 2005, he started as a private consultant, recruited by a Dutch bank in Romania to help setting up the economic department of the bank, and he kept on the consultancy part until December 2016, since he took up politics, became a member of the parliament. Afterwards, he was the Minister of Finance in Romania and the Prime Minister in Romania. Nowadays, he is the President of the Senate. He is known to the public as an economist that upholds economic freedom, free market and property rights, as well as transparency in public policy. He opposes pro-cyclical monetary and fiscal policies, and the solutions that he offers empowers individuals and restore their freedom of choice. Mr. President, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for the great introduction. Well, I didn't write a speech because I think it's great to just speak with people about this overlapping crisis. You don't have to write a speech. I just going to tell you my experience in government for the last couple of years, because we had overlapping crises and we had to deal with them. As a free marketeer, you know, I don't think I've ever been a libertarian being put to test like I was in the last 2 years. And some of the things I did as I expected, and some of them I didn't, and I think this is the setting where we should actually debate if that was correct or not. But it's good to be talking to people that believe in free markets. And you know, this is nowadays it's harder and harder to find this public discourse in the mainstream. It is being cluttered by a lot of populistic and very left ideas coming from the left. So without further ado, yeah, when I entered politics in 2016, I entered as I am today, the same guy, as a free marketeer, and trying to, so the attempt was to change Romanian economics, the Romanian economy, the structure of the Romanian economy for the better. And when I say the better, it's where an economy where prices are used to reallocate resources and not decisions by the government. Basically, this is what we believe in, that you know, it's the wisdom of markets that should be the ones allocating resources, not a decision of some bureaucrat, minister, prime minister, indifferent of their background, education, or whatever it says on their CV. I think, you know, we should all be humble enough to understand and to see that actually, you know, the information that markets are giving us, it's much, much better and more efficient than what we have. So in 2019, the party I'm a member of, the Liberal Party, ousted the socialists, and we took power as a minority government. At that point, we said something that I still keep today. We wanted to show that if you actually, you can increase actual revenues without increasing taxes. You can increase revenues even though you lower taxes. All you have to do is to have the government act as a partner with the rest of the economy. So my bet was, if the government pays its invoices in time, if the government doesn't, you know, coerce private companies into doing things, if we allow the market to decide prices, then revenues will increase, and then we could have, you know, expenditures. Of course, we said that we're going to look on the expenditure side, and we're going to cut any expenditure that was non-productive, or we slow their growth. There's, you know, a few of those things. A few months into the being in government, we were hit by a negative shock, which, you know, it happens. This is something, you know, and all of you know that forecasting, it's just really a messy business, and whoever says that they can forecast well, it lies to you, because nobody can forecast, you know, perfectly. So we're hit by a by a shock, a negative shock, which is the pandemic. And basically, no one has foreseen that we had to close the economy down for 2 months. This is something that, you know, no economic model can tell you how to react to. You have an economy and you close it down for 2 months, but then basically you have, if you don't pay invoices to your wages, or if you don't continue somehow in the background, then everything stops, and it's just a total collapse. And that was the challenge. The challenge was how you keep the production capacity going, because, you know, you have to assume that the pandemic will end at some point. So how do you keep the production capacity intact? You keep the labor force intact, ready to come back to work, and, you know, pay wages for those people that are in the private sector, but also in the public sector, but also the private sector should be, you know, contained. So there's few measures that are seen as interventionist. You know, we have to admit that. At that point, when the economy was closed down, we had to do something. So I looked at what happened in 2011. And we said, at this point, should the whole economy share the cost? So, for example, technical unemployment. Should the cost of technical unemployment be borne just by the company itself, or we should spread this cost around in the economy? There are people actually, the decision to close down the economy was the government decision. So we had to, decide how we spread the cost. We know these people will be staying home because it was the government decision. We wanted not to spread the virus, and the reason was that if we allow the virus to be spread, then there's big costs on healthcare system and everything. So we had to take that decision. So then I said, well, let's just have the technical unemployment costs borne by the government, and then we spread the cost throughout the society, and that means we all pitch into this effort. So those people that stay home, we pay, 75% of their wages and things like that. In the same time, although there are a lot of calls to be very drastic, I was very adamant to keep a lot businesses open. So I wanted to have the supermarkets open and talk to those companies, what do they need to have their supermarkets open. I wanted to have, delivery. This was the business that just sprung during the pandemic. I wanted to have it open 24 hours. Although, the experts were telling us there's a risk, they can spread the disease. I said, it's a minimum risk that we should take also, but allow people to have this luxury. So it was that decision. We had another decision, a lot of those people are staying home, they're not receiving all their wages, but they already have, they had invoices they had to pay, electricity, bank payments, et cetera, et cetera. So then there was a negotiation with the banking sector for a moratorium. And that was something done together with the banking sector, where some of the cost, so we spread the cost three ways. Some of the cost was borne by the banking sector. So they admitted taking a loss. They took a hit themselves. Some of the cost to the insurance of those measures was taken by the government, and some of the cost was taken by the clients themselves. So we spread the cost three ways, and it worked. And finally, in the end, not that many people used the facility to postpone their bank payments. We assumed there'll be millions, but actually were 300,000 or 400,000 people that did that. Otherwise, people actually kept paying their rates, bank rates. Maybe it helped because they have technical unemployment. So those were two of the measures. And the third measure, we were looking around Europe, and most of governments said, we're going to give subsidies to companies. We close them down, we're going to give them subsidies. My problem was that if we give subsidies, we could actually, you're not able to weed out the bad companies. You're actually saving everyone. So we said, okay, we're not giving subsidies. We created the program called MMA Investing, where we'll give companies loans, but there's no interest for a while, and they're 100% guaranteed by the government also for a while. So this way, you have companies, if they know their business is going to continue to grow, they can actually decide themselves to take the loan or not take the loan. And we've seen that actually that program has been even now the coalition of the socialists is keeping the program. Is a good program. So it cost us less than it cost all the other EU countries. And I think it was a better program because we saved the good companies. Obviously, there's been bankruptcies during this period, and it was normal. So this is a shock that you cannot see happening, and when it happens, I try to have the reaction to it as much as possible close to a free market solution. But I have to tell you, it was impossible to have just a free market solution. Just take your hands off and just say, listen, you guys are on your own. Just the things were too interconnected, and it could not have. But what I wanted to do, and this is, I think, is the challenge for when you work in the public office, for anyone that believes in free markets, is that every decision you take has to have has to limit the intervention as much as possible and to allow the decision to the ones that actually take the risk and the capital. So that was the first part of and the bet was, my bet was that if I'm correct, and these are the measures decided by the market and together with us, but the market takes actually most of the decision, we'll have a fast recovery and we'll have a lower than estimated drop in GDP. So we had both, basically. Romanian economy had a recession, but at lower impact than estimated by all the institutions and by everybody else, and we had a faster economic growth by any account. And last year we started the year estimating an economic growth of 4%, a recovery of 4%, and actually we did around 6%. So this shows you what happens when you allow the market actually to do most of the work. Now we come back to this year, another shock, a negative shock. I'm not there anymore, so I'm speaking from the outside. You have another negative shock. You cannot blame anyone for not foreseeing the shock. It's something that nobody has saw coming. Maybe the intelligence guys saw it coming, whatever, but in the government, I'm sure they didn't know there was going to be a war. So you have a negative shock that's affecting you, other things. It's affecting the energy market. But this shock, I say, it's easier than the one in 2020 because markets are functioning. You have to remember that in 2020, in March, none of the markets were functioning internationally. And we went internationally and borrowed money, and we borrowed a very low interest rate. So it's all about trust. So this year, the solutions actually we see are a bit different. There are solutions that actually are imposing decisions on companies. They're mostly subsidies. They're transfers coming from the government to people, but they're not actually solutions that allow the ones that have the capital, they risk their capital to decide how to do things. So my bet is, and we'll see in a few months if I'm correct, my bet is that this year we'll have a lower, or let's put it this way, the economy will have a worse year than estimated, and the recovery will not happen as fast. It's actually going to be lingering for a longer period. So, I'm trying to give you the whole picture now. When you are in office, you'll have shocks all the time. There'll be shocks all the time. There'll be something happening. And if you spend your time trying to estimate the shock, you're spending time in the wrong part. Because you're never going to be able to estimate the shock, where it's going to come, when the recession is going to come, how big it's going to be. All you can do is to prepare the economy, so you have a flexible economy, and that's what he did throughout the last year, digitize it, making it more digital, making labor more flexible, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one of the things you can do. But the other thing you can do is to be prepared when the shock happens to take measures that allow most of the decision to be taken in the market, not by the government. This way, you guarantee that the shock is mitigated, so the impact of the shock is lower in the economy, but actually the recovery is faster. That's the best you can do. This is my experience in government as a free marketeer dealing with two different shocks. So again, we had a terrible shock in 2020. The economy, because we took the measures that were closer to the market, the economy dropped lower than expected, but it recovered faster. Now we're in a different situation. The measures are mostly from the left, with subsidies, transfers, things that, you don't have to take any decision. You just take the money in your account and do whatever you want to do with them. You just increase the deficit. And we see that. We see that actually inflation is higher than expected, and the central bank is coming from behind and is not able to control it. We see interest rates are increasing. So my bet is that this year the economy will actually go to zero recession, and then the recovery, it will take a long, long time. Bottom line, I think it's the solutions are with the free market always. The last 2 years have shown that, and in our quest to actually have lower, more efficient government, smaller government, has proven that this is the only way. And I think this is a very good test for what we, try to show to the world that when you implement solutions that are market tested, everyone is benefiting from them. Thank you, and have a great conference today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Interesting speech. I'll just draw some remarks at the end after all three speeches, and then we'll have actually questions and answers as a session at the end of the debates. Our next speaker, Lawrence Reed. He was the president of the Foundation for Economic Education since 2008. Then he went to an honorific function there as well. He was part actually of the board of trustees of the Foundation for Economic Education since 1990s. And he is writing and speaking about economic education since 1970s. Prior to becoming the president, he served for 21 years as president of a Center for Public Policy in Michigan. He taught economics full-time to several universities in the US. He is actually a champion for liberty. Larry has authored nearly 2,000 newspaper columns and articles and dozens of articles in magazines and journals in the United States and abroad. He has authored or co-authored several books. The most recent being Was Jesus a Socialist? This is a major expansion in the 2020 of an earlier essay of his. His interests in political and economic affairs have taken him as a freelance journalist in 87 countries, almost close to half of the countries in the world, on 6 continents. He's an advisor to numerous organizations around the world. So let's hear Larry's speech. Larry, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming today. And I want to express special appreciation for the opportunity to share a platform with the President of the Senate and former Prime Minister. He's a man from afar that I have admired and have said some very good things about. So I hope he has an opportunity again in the future to advance the liberal reforms in which he so firmly believes. The topic of our 2 panels today gives the speakers an opportunity individually to pick whichever crisis they want to talk about, because there are multiple crises in the world today. And the one that most concerns me, and the one I'll talk about, is the rising price inflation, and I think also the impending recession that is likely to be worldwide. First, a few words about the inflation. Here in Romania, I'm not sure what the rate of price inflation may be at the moment, but in the US, it is setting records that we haven't seen in 40 years. Prices, on average, are rising in the vicinity of 8% on an official basis. Probably the real rate is several points higher than that. We haven't seen that in the United States since the 1970s. It's important when discussing inflation to define the term properly. If you were to take to the streets of any city, perhaps in the world, and ask ordinary citizens, what do you think inflation is? I think most people would say it's rising prices. But as an economist of the Austrian school, I have to tell you that that's not what inflation is. Rising prices are one of the consequences of inflation. They follow the real inflation. They're a sign that you have conducted inflation, but they are not the inflation itself. It's sort of like saying, what causes rain? Well, the answer to that is not wet streets, right? Wet streets are a consequence of inflation, or of rain, I should say. You have the rain first, and then you have the streets getting wet. I think the proper definition of inflation is critical if you're going to examine where it comes from and what to do about it. I define inflation not as rising prices, but rather as an increase in the quantity of money and credit, especially an increase in the quantity of money and credit that exceeds the demand for money and credit. And we have seen a great deal of that, not only in the United States, but pretty much across the world in recent years. You know, one of the never-ending problems of those of us who sometimes advise those in government is to try to get them to think long-term, to don't think of simply the here and now, right at the moment, but think of the long-term consequences of things. If only we could get more in government to do that, I think a lot of the mischief that is conducted as policy we could avoid. Inflation is first and foremost, as Milton Friedman put it, a monetary phenomenon. It is an increase in the quantity of money and credit in excess of the demand for money and credit. The question then we must ask is, okay, if that's what it is, who does it? Who conducts it? Where does it come from? You know, if you change the definition, you change the responsibility, right? If you define inflation as rising prices, well, then you might be led to conclude that the culprit in inflation would be people who own stores. They keep raising prices. Or it's Saudi oil sheiks, it's OPEC, it's fill in the blank. It's everybody but the actual monetary authorities. But if you define inflation as an increase in the quantity of money and credit, and then ask, okay, who does that? Where does that come from? You're led into very different directions. And of course, across the world, for decades now, the source of inflation has been the monetary authority of central governments, the central banks and their allies in the government of each country. You know, even Milton Friedman, I've cited him now twice. I'm of the Austrian school, not precisely of the same school of thought he was, but I admire him for his many fantastic insights. Even Milton Friedman, who wouldn't go quite as far as, say, I would when it comes to addressing the inflation issue and getting government out of the money business altogether, he nonetheless once said that money is too important to be left to the central bankers. That's a profound statement. Even Milton Friedman believed very strongly that central bankers would invariably, with the power that they have, would mess things up. That the important role of monetary reform must be to put markets back in charge of money and take politics as much as possible out of the business of the production of money and credit. I think he was right, although we can argue about what those proper solutions would be. So the definition of inflation is critically important. If you go back to 9/11 in 2001 in the United States, the response of the American Federal Reserve System, the monetary authorities of my country, was to immediately begin expanding the quantity of money and credit. It saw an impending serious economic crisis, partly because of 9/11, so it immediately began depressing interest rates, expanding money and credit, and it did that for an extremely long period of time, for quite a few years, 6, 7, maybe 8 years. And then by 2008, we began to see a reversal of policy on the part of the Fed. It began to raise interest rates to choke off the growth in the money supply. And what was the painful result of that? The 2008 crash. We see this cycle over and over and over again. You have government and its central banks inflating money and credit, and in the short run, things look pretty good. But it sets the stage for an eventual correction that is going to be very painful when it finally happens. It sets the stage for interest rates at some point to stop falling and begin to rise and to help choke off the economic growth. And we saw that by 2008. Interest rates had begun to rise, and we saw a full-scale recession. Some places you might even say it was a depression. This is the merry-go-round that we seem not to get governments off of. They do this over and over again. You think we could say, well, okay, but they learned a lesson with the painful 2008 correction. Wouldn't it be great to look back and say, they did not resort to the inflation again of money and credit that caused the recession or depression of 2008. I wish I could say that. But they've been busy doing the same thing again, keeping interest rates artificially low, pumping up money and credit. Do you know that in the last 2.5 years, in the United States at least, the money and credit supply has grown by more than 30%? That's incredible. You cannot have a sustained period of time of artificially low interest rates and such massive increases in the quantity of money and credit and not set yourself up someday for a painful correction. It's often there's an analogy that's often been used, I think is very instructive, of a man who goes to a party. And while he's at the party, he drinks like a fish. Okay? He feels great for a time, right? Wow, give me another. He goes home at 2 a.m. in the morning, still feeling pretty good, but what happens a few hours later? The painful hangover, all right? Let's suppose you meet him at 8 the next morning, and he's suffering from the hangover. They've got a headache, he feels terrible, and you now feel sympathetic. You want to do something to help him. You have two options. You could say to him, here's another bottle. Have another drink. And if he takes that drink, he may feel good again. But doesn't that simply put off the day of reckoning? Doesn't that simply postpone? He's going to have another hangover later? We can't keep doing that. Instead, if you really want to help that man when he's in the midst of his hangover, what would you do? You would say to him, you know, you feel terrible at the moment. But this moment is not the time when the damage is being done. You did the damage last night when you were having a good time. You didn't realize it at the time because it felt so good, but you were setting yourself up for this painful period the next morning. So really, you should wind the clock back and say, don't drink like a fish at the party the night before if you don't want a painful hangover the next day. The problem with central banking these days, and with so many others officials in government, is they only think short term. They don't think long term. They think, oh, we've got a crisis. What can we do? Let's do something for the moment, even if it produces painful consequences and results down the line. We'll let somebody else take care of that. That doesn't solve the problem. That's not fixing the fundamentals. You know, the economist John Maynard Keynes of Great Britain, who had so much influence in the 20th century, was once asked something of this nature. Mr. Keynes, if we follow your advice and government gets bigger, spends more money, prints more money, won't the value of the currency fall and maybe someday become worthless? And his famous reply was, in the long run, we're all dead anyway. Now, does that really make sense? Is that the kind of policy that you want? Do you want governments to just do what may seem good for the moment? Do you want it to simply give the economy another bottle so that it could get drunk again? If so, you're not thinking about what happens afterwards. You're not thinking long term. So I find time and time again that those of us who interact with government officials, we're constantly having to remind them to think of the long term. There are a lot of things you can do in the moment that may make you feel good, for which you will pay a painful price later. So why do that? I fear that that's a lesson that governments all over the world have still not learned. And so that we are setting ourselves up again for a painful correction. Right now, we're beginning to see the early signs of it. You see price inflation at 40-year highs, not just in the US, but in many places. Interest rates are still artificially low. Central banks are beginning to raise them, but look at the difference between nominal interest rates and price inflation. You have price inflation in the US at say 8%, you got interest rates at 2%. What's the real rate of interest after inflation? It's negative, right? We're still artificially throwing money on the fire, which means at some point to deal with rising price inflation, central banks like the Federal Reserve will have to substantially, dramatically raise interest rates. They have no choice. If they want to choke off the problem of rising price inflation, they're going to do what they've always done. They're going to take the bottle away from the party. They're going to raise interest rates. They may have to raise them far more than almost anybody today anticipates as a way to stem those dramatically high rates of price inflation. And that invariably sets you up for the painful corrective phase of the business cycle called a recession or depression. It is so sadly mistaken when critics of capitalism or free markets claim that the business cycle is part of free markets. Critics of capitalism and free markets love to say, see, when you have capitalism or free markets, you will have these painful business cycles, booms and busts. Well, it's true under socialism, you don't have that so much, right? Because all you have is bust. You know, you never have a boom. So maybe you don't have much of a cycle under socialism because it irons out the business cycle by eliminating the boom part. So you end up with a kind of a permanent bust or recession or depression. But the cause of these roller coaster policies or the roller coaster effects in an economy is the roller coaster monetary policy. And I don't think economies can sustain that forever, because each time we go through this painful process, you end up weakening the currency, you weaken the consensus for freedom and free markets. When recessions happen, people kind of go crazy and they begin to endorse policies of government that in normal times they would think would be stupid. Don't do that. But crisis, we have to do it. And out the window go your liberties. So I would like to conclude by simply saying, if we can do nothing else, if we could accomplish just one objective with our friends in government and in central banks in particular, it should be think long term. Stop doing this short-term stuff that makes you feel good or makes the economy look good for a moment. Stop passing out the bottles of liquor and getting people drunk, because all you're doing is setting us up for the hangover phase, for which we will all pay a painful price. So hold on to your hats. I think because governments haven't learned this lesson yet, we are probably in for continued increases in price inflation, followed by some measure of correction, recession. How deep it will be is anyone's guess. But we must get off of this roller coaster of crazy monetary policy. And one final word, by the way. In America, we have the worst budgetary situation that we've had perhaps in our history. We're going into a recession with $1 trillion deficit in the federal budget. How big do you think that will become if revenues fall dramatically in a recession and spending, as it invariably does, goes up? You have to begin to wonder how much capital can the U.S. government suck up in covering its deficits before it becomes enormously and painfully and permanently depressive. So a balanced budget should be part of a long-term picture. I don't think anybody in the world would believe a government if it said, we're for sound money, we want to stop inflation. At the same time, it has $1 trillion deficit. It can't manage its own fiscal house. Who would believe, who should believe a government that claims to be defending the integrity of its currency, at the same time it has such massive deficits? Again, that's short-term thinking instead of planning for the long run. Thank you all. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Larry. Just to make a short joke, why I think long-term, even we'll be, at that point, we'll all be dead at some point, so why think long-term? But let's not go that way. Let's hope governments will start thinking long-term for the countries and for the people of the countries. Our next speaker is Chris Lingle. He is a professor of economics in the Escuela de Negocios at Universitat Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala. He earned a doctorate of economics in the US in 1977, and since then he taught at universities in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the United States. He is a passionate supporter of human creativity and voluntary actions that led to social harmony. That's why he tries to engage in discussions on the merits of institutions and public policy in terms of their impact on human liberty and dignity. His research interests are in the areas of political economy, international economics, with a focus on emerging market economies and public policy reform in the east of and East and Central Europe, East Asia, Latin America, and Southern Africa. He wrote several books on the economies in the Asian continent. So let's hear Chris on what he has to tell us. Chris, you have the floor.
I suppose it would be impolite to say it's a good thing that in the long run Keynes is dead, but unlike him, I plan to live forever. So I'm deeply concerned with the state of affairs that we are left with, given that many of his followers have interpreted his insights as basically a blank check to run the kind of budget deficits that Larry alluded to. Now, I'm going to take a slightly different approach to the issue here, and I'm going to try to really touch on just 2 points. How do we get to these crises? Larry talked about a particular aspect, and I think the other speakers may as well. And then what would we expect to resolve these crises? So the first part will be somewhat pessimistic, and I hope the second part will be a bit more optimistic. Now, how do we get here? Well, we know what the crises are. We could talk about the collapse of many economies, based upon COVID policies, not based upon a disease or a virus, but the policy choices, the poor policy choices that were made by governments around the world, following, by the way, an autocratic and dictatorial regime, a Leninist regime in Asia, China, that is. So I think what we need to understand is that we really could think of this in an umbrella concept, that this is where we are today with respect to, and of course the other crisis is the Ukraine-Russia conflict, the special operations as we are told to believe it is. We're really facing a crisis of leadership and governance. What we have found is that our political leaders, the bureaucrats that are meant to serve us, but perhaps serve political interest, the so-called experts, whether in public health or economics, and with all respect to my friends in the media, I think we have a problem with the leadership and how the media interacts within that context. So this crisis of leadership is really about, in my interpretation, a transformation of the political system of governance that most of us identify with, so-called representative democracy. Now, what has happened over time is that what we expect from government through this democratic process has changed remarkably from what it was originally seen to be at the outset of these modern experiments with democracy, perhaps starting with the USA. Now, in other words, government through democracy was about protecting the rights and freedoms of the individual. This was the purpose. We were moving away from autocratic monarchies, emperors, and we were putting individual, living, breathing human beings at the heart of political governance. That was the purpose of government. Now, we have found ourselves in a situation where who has the first claim over your income? Your husband, your wife, your family, your friends? No, the state. And if there's anything left over, well, you can have it. It was not meant to be that way. Why do we have taxation in the beginning of this idea of modern democracy? Well, taxation was there to provide a very few goods, perhaps goods or services that the market might underproduce, that we would use collectively, but there are very few of those. But now what we have is that representative democracy has become a game of redistribution. That is, I win elections by promising to take from you to give to her. So taxation is a redistributive tool rather than a mechanism to provide some things, perhaps national defense, perhaps justice, perhaps a stable money supply. These were the sort of standard ideas at that time. But no longer. Taxation is about a game, taking from one group to give to another. And what we find ourselves in is a situation where politics divides us rather than unites us. We're no longer united under a common theme of, I want to live my life with dignity. And we understand that democracy was supposed to be a mechanism where you could live it would be an institutional framework where you could live your life with the same dignity. And there may be a sort of the state was sort of a moderator in that regard. But now the state, under representative democracy, has become the central focus of our lives, not our individual destiny. We are all, at the moment, whether or not we're living under tragic conditions in Kiev, or we're living in a place where there's peace, like here, but we still cannot escape the arbitrary decisions of those who wield the power of the state, either through their capability of taxation or being able to imprison us for actions that may simply violate a local moral code, whereas we lived in another state or another country. That activity that we engage in would not be considered neither immoral nor illegal. So the question then becomes, what is our appropriate goal? Is it to promote democracy, or is it to promote human liberty? Unfortunately, the narrative, and I'm quite conscious of this when I look at declarations, but everyone seems to agree that democracy is where it's an end rather than a means. It was meant to be a means to deliver human dignity, human autonomy, human prosperity. But we have shifted towards a more collective concept of the state, the people, instead of the individual. Society does not bleed. You cannot cut society and see blood. But the human being, this is where we should be concerned with how do we, in fact, protect the integrity, the future of each individual. So we need a shift in sort of focus in that regard, I believe. Now, the idea of crisis, years back, I became a very strong opponent to using the term crisis, partly because Karl Marx introduced the term crisis into the vocabulary of economists by talking about these inevitable crises because of the internal and fatal contradictions of capitalism. Well, so I did an online search for how many times in the economic literature the term crisis appeared. And it was very seldom. There were the Great Depression, things like that, and a few economic downturns in the 19th century. But economists that were not Marxists very seldom used the term crisis. Until about 1984, when we began to see the term become not only used by economists, but by journalists. The Latin American debt crisis was one of the can be almost seen as a breaking point there. And since then, we've had successive and often increasingly larger crises in economics. And the terminology has become, the term crisis has become used, it's part of our daily life. Whereas it wasn't once. It wasn't part of the mainstream economist vocabulary. So what we see, I would suggest to you that especially those crises that either had regional or global impact can be traced to a crisis of leadership. Either in the particular country where people made bad decisions. The Latin American debt crisis was pretty much like what it is now. Many Latin American governments simply borrowed too much because they were paying an interest rate which was below what they should have paid given their capacities to repay their debt. But I met a German banker when I lived in Luxembourg at that time, and she was going to lend money to all these, she worked for one of the Landesbanks. And she said, well, it's no problem. They can repay their debt because they can raise taxes. And I looked and I said, oh my God, we're in trouble when we have people like that. And of course, government officials love that sort of story. But look what happened to Greece. Greece tried that, being a member of the Euro. They overextended themselves, and they fell into crisis. Now, every country in the world is poised to look like Greece did some years back because of the excessive borrowing based upon artificially low interest rates. And the direction of change can almost only be that interest rates can and will go up. And when they do, that's when we're going to see a very serious correction along the lines of what Larry said, because the debt market, which is already in astronomical territory, the value of the debt market is roughly 4 times the stock market capitalization, the global stock market capitalization. So the problems that we face, the biggest problems we face, are going to come from the debt market, the collapse of bonds, bond markets. When interest rates go up, bond prices are going to collapse. Now, so this idea of crisis, we have to understand, in many ways, is a self-inflicted wound. And it's in large part because our leaders, our political leaders, the experts that advise them, have failed us. But in a way, they're not totally at fault. Because what happened is that they're responding to the incentives generated by representative democracy. But it's also because we didn't understand that representative democracy can only survive if the power of the state is limited. Because once the power of the state expands, and the purpose of the state is to redistribute income and wealth from one group to another, then it's only a battle between those forces that will divide us. So we'll be either the makers, as we say, the producers, or the takers, the recipients. The recipients want more. You won't give us more. You're evil. You're wrong. Capitalism is selfish, whatever. And the producers are saying, why should I give? I've given enough. The results are not there. It's not improving people's lives. So we become more and more divided by an institutional arrangement that was supposed to unite us as human beings. I accept democracy because it protects me and it protects you. The only way it can protect me is to protect you. It's not what it's about anymore. It's to take from you to give to someone else. It was not meant to be this way. So we have to recapture the appropriate goal of governance, political governance, the protection of human liberty and the rights of the individual to live a dignified life. And we're not there. So these crises that we see, whether it's Ukraine and the conflict with the imperialist forces of Russia, or we look at the destruction of livelihoods, dreams through COVID policies, that we're treating a new virus and the disease associated with it as though it was the Spanish flu revisiting us. It wasn't. These policy choices didn't have to be what they were. There were other options. I began exploring those other options in March of 2020 when it evolved. I haven't changed my perspective on it. It's been very frustrating to see decisions made about our lives and fortunes based upon bad medical and scientific advice. How do we get out of these crises? That's my second theme. It's only through individual initiatives and private action. Because if I'm correct, as I've suggested to you, that we cannot trust the leadership, because, again, it's not the individual political official or bureaucrat. They're reacting to the incentives within which they operate. So we can't blame them, per se. All we can hope for is that we are able to see enough space given to private initiatives, to entrepreneurial insights. Because economic growth is not coming from the state. Economic growth comes from private sector initiatives. That's where we can hope for a recovery from these crises. So I'm optimistic. I believe in human beings. My whole focus of life in teaching has been to try to promote the capacity of individual humans to live their own lives as they wish, as long as it's peaceful. To not necessarily admire what they do, but to respect it, because you hope they respect your right to accomplish what you set out to live and to do. We got here in a way we were all, in many ways, to blame, because we were too focused on this thing that's gone wrong, democracy, and we did not give enough attention to human liberty. We were not alert to the fact that governments were taking over, because if the state has more power, you have less freedom. If the state has more resources, you have less, because the state produces almost nothing that it doesn't take from us. The state creates an institutional framework within which we make our decisions. And they can make that space larger or smaller. In that sense, they might be productive, but they don't produce, because nothing the state has that they didn't take away from us. That's just the nature of the beast. We lost sight of these things somehow. And so, should the glass be half empty or half full? Are you optimistic that the state within which you live will follow the ideas of expanding the scope of human liberty? Or will it be more of the same? Will the central banks be allowed to inflate the currency without any concern for the future? I mean, I'm really amazed at the capacity for people who are much more intelligent than me, that have attended better universities than I did. But they remain trapped in an economic model that tells them they're doing the right thing. Okay, if we have problems in the economy and we want to boost economic activity, lower interest rates. That didn't work. Interest rates weren't low enough. Make them lower. Whoop. Make them lower. Whoop. Make them lower. Zero. Make them lower. Negative interest rates. Negative interest rates? A child would not engage in a transfer where I promise I'm going to give you less than what you give me. You have to have a PhD in macroeconomics to believe that nonsense. So, how is it these people, well, they're just trapped in a model. They really can't believe. This goes against human nature. This is where we are. So, I hope I leave you with at least an idea that there can be a way out. And it's up to you, us, and our political leaders, if we're allowed to take that route or not. more human liberty, less outside control of our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Let's say in that the classical economic system, how it is built, the Keynesian economics, is starting maybe from the wrong point of view, in which they don't put the individual and the human thought at the center of it. So maybe that's also one of the reasons. I'll try to do some very brief closing remarks, but before that, let's see if there are questions from the public. So please, there are microphones in the room, so please try to approach one of the microphones and we'll try to do that. I think we have a question from microphone 3.
Can I go ahead?
Yeah.
So Cristian Năsulea from the University of Bucharest, and building on what both Larry Reid and Chris Lingle were saying, I'd like to ask a question that perhaps Florin Câțu might be the best to answer. How does a libertarian reconcile these ideas about constraining the money supply and the need to keep government out of these things with the European Recovery and Resilience Plan, with the National Development Plan, with all of this free money that was given to various entities within Romanian society and within European society to do things that might be potentially useful, but that in fact represent direct interference by the political into the economy? Thank you.
Well, great question. First of all, when you come into office, you take over a system that's set up there. But before I answer the question, I just have to say that when I was in government, I borrowed at negative interest rates. I convinced the markets to give me money at negative interest rates. I think there's actually different layers. And some things I do behind smoke screens. So for example, the PNRR and those things are happening, but I have conditions there. The reforms implemented in PNRR, which means that those money are coming only if we make the state more efficient and smaller. So you can get the billions from PNRR only if you reform the pension system to be sustainable, so that's a condition there. Only if you reform the public wage system to be somehow related to performance, and also you can get the money only if you reform the public administration system to make it more efficient. So I put in there a few things. Also last year, while central bank it's independent, what we managed to do is to lower the deficit from 10% to around 6%, I think 6.7 or 6.6. I remember exactly last year. So at the same time, as I was trying to use different levels. It's hard, of course, but the aim was always to, if you inject money through some, fiscal policy, but showing that you're reducing it going forward and it's a credible path, then you could actually do some of those things. As I said, it's not perfect. Every measure that we've taken, it's a decision by the government, but I'm trying to have every time when I was able to take those decisions to design it in such a way that if you apply to those programs, then it's not actually free, like the MMA Invest. It's a loan. Okay, there's some benefits there, but if you don't know that your business is going to go on, then you're not going to take it. And not everyone took that loan. The same thing with forgiving your interest, paying your rates to the bank. Not everyone applied because it was not actually really free. There were some conditions attached to it, and for some people it was worse than if to postpone for 9 months paying their rates and actually making an effort to paying the rates today. So I'm trying every time, and I tried every time to have this designing the measures. They are not just free money. making the people that use this think about it. You know, technical unemployment was the same way. You know, you don't give the entire wage, you give a part of the wage, but I leave the company open for delivery, for example, restaurants. So a lot of those people didn't actually use technical employment. They just let their people work there and they pay them. There was a problem, they didn't get tips. So, you know, it was not perfect. It's not perfect. It's hard to get a system that hasn't been reformed for 30 years. I'm talking about Romania. That hasn't been reformed for 30 years, and it's been, you know, you have a lot of state-owned companies, a lot of issues. I mean, you can't imagine once you get inside all the things that you look at on the outside. You say, you know, we should use prices, interest rates, the markets to reallocate resources. When you go inside, you can't imagine the resistance of the system that's already set up to allocate resources based on the decision of the government. That it takes, you have to be imaginative to fool the system that actually they're going to take the decision. When they realize too late, it's not their decision, it's actually the market. But you have to create all these things. I know it's a longer answer, but you know, in the context of Romania, we have to understand that we tried and we managed a bit of a shift in 2020 and 2021. I'm afraid the shift has stopped. And I'm afraid now we're going to shift the other way around where we were before 2020. But we managed a bit of a shift in that period.
I think also Larry wants to add something on that.
I agree. This is a great question, but I would answer by referring back to one of my main points, which was to get people to think long term. And to illustrate that, let me remind you that thinking long term is part of the growing up process. Babies don't think long term. Have you ever met a 3-year-old who's thinking about retirement? Have you ever met a 5-year-old who is thinking about what college to go to? Babies don't think long term, but adults should. And I might also add that I think as babies, we're probably all socialists. Think about it, because every baby wants it now. He doesn't care where it comes from. He doesn't care what it costs. And if you don't give it to him, he's going to scream and wet his pants. But at some point, as you grow up, that should mean that you realize, wow, that's not mine. I can't just take it. Somebody had to work to produce that. I should respect the rights and the lives and the choices of other people. That's what it means to be an adult. But today we have millions of people all across the world who still think and act like babies. Socialists are babies with guns.
Thank you very much, Larry. Let's have another question, please, on mic 2.
So, yeah. I have a question to Mr. Larry Reid, I think. So I have a question, which is, when is going to be the next recession or depression? Like, taking account that Biden aid, COVID-19, and we all know that America has a debt of $1 trillion, and everybody has a debt to somebody. And it's like kind of impossible to escape this debt, because you were talking about, hey, we shall escape the debt, but it's impossible because having debt, and it's nearly impossible. You have to declare bankruptcy, and it doesn't work in this way on international level. So the question is, when is going to be the recession or depression, and how is it going to affect Europe as a whole, like us, because, you know, America influenced a lot of the deal, which goes here in Brussels, here in Romania, and yeah. Like your opinion on that topic, like the next 5 years, because like a ticking bomb, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll be talking about recession. Sorry. Thank you. I think we'll be talking about recession rather in a widespread way before the end of this year. If it doesn't formally begin, we'll see evident signs of it with a declining stock market and rising interest rates, and a great deal of concern and loss of confidence on the part of consumers and business investors. So 2023 is likely, I think, to be a recession year. I have no idea how deep it will be. It depends a great deal on the reaction of government policymakers. When you look back at the Great Depression of the 1930s, you'll find that it too was preceded by a period of rampant price money supply creation. The money supply from 1924 to 1929 grew by some 66% in the United States. We call that the Roaring Twenties. And everybody thought, wow, I hope this goes on forever. But then the Federal Reserve moved in the opposite direction, slammed on the brakes, began to hike interest rates dramatically, and we fell into recession. But what a lot of people don't realize is we didn't have a depression immediately. In fact, by the spring of 1930, after the stock market had fallen apart in the previous fall, by the spring of 1930, we only had 8% unemployment. That's not a depression yet, that's just a recession. The stock market regained half of the ground it had lost. But what took a recession and made it a depression were additional interventions by government, dramatically raising tariffs, dramatically raising taxes. The top tax rate more than doubled in 1932. So, you can have a short, sharp, corrective recession that can be needlessly prolonged and made deeper if government doesn't do the right thing when it faces those conditions, if it responds by further interventions that only keep the patient on the hospital bed a lot longer than he needs to be.
I just want to say one thing. It's true. There's always a call for interventionist measures when there's a recession. I remember in 2020 and last year, there's a lot of calls for banning exports, for example. There's a little bit of a crisis somewhere. It's like all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, we should stop. We stop exporting some product, whatever. It was oil or something like that. And it was very hard in 2020 to keep people. And actually, there was an incident where the Minister of Agriculture taken a decision by himself to ban some sort of exports for wheat, I think. And basically, the decision was so poorly written that we banned exports of all the products that came out of wheat and everything. We created an international incident with the US and everything, and they had to take it back. Now we see the same calls. We see calls from the society that, the price of something is increasing, and immediately everyone's like, well, we should ban that good. Those things retaliate. Immediately, if you ban an export, then you should expect that the people that you export to, they'll retaliate against you, and this is how we start a commercial war. So while I was there, I always stopped those, but those calls are real, and people will ask you, and there'll be someone in the government coming to you and saying, convincing you this is the reason to do it.
There's a problem that emerges. Some economists, and if you ask a child, what would be the consequence of a war? Well, they would say, destroying lives, enslaving people through conscription, destruction of capital. It can't be good. But a PhD in macroeconomics would say, no, having a war is a way to restore the economy. This is what we were told, that World War II snapped the world out of it. So, believe it or not, then Ukraine will become the richest country in the world if you have the mentality of a PhD in macroeconomics. But that would be clearly seen through by even a 10-year-old child. So beware of experts. They can misguide us.
Thank you all. Let's take another question, please.
Yeah, for Chris Lingle, I have for you a question, because you're from Spain. So actually I was thinking about COVID-19 and how it's influenced borrowing in Europe. For example, Germany gives loans to Italy and Spain. So by doing that, Spain and Italy, they are losing their influence. They are somehow became the slaves of Germany. So my question is, like, what do you think about that? Like, how it influenced this kind of borrowing? Because it's the same situation as Greece. Like, if you take into account what happened to Greece like 10 years ago, it's the same in a way. It's the way in which Italy borrows money and Spain is the same way as Greece? Because, you know, what do you think about this situation? That's my... Yeah. Did you get the question?
Try to repeat that, please. Try to make it much shorter.
How COVID-19 influenced the borrowing in Europe? So we know that Germany gives loans to Italy and Spain. So by doing that, Italy and Spain somehow they are losing their independence. It's the same way as Greece lost its in the days, you know, back in the days. So, I mean, everybody speaks about that in Italy and also in Spain, because they have to, when it was in 2020, was the COVID-19, they had to borrow money. And the only country that was able to borrow money was Germany. Europe, yeah, I mean, Germany gives to everybody money, so, but yeah.
The problem is always state spending. Politicians were spending like what we call drunken sailors. In other words, they were satisfying this redistributive game. They were playing the redistributive game, so they kept expanding government spending. Now, one of the big problems within the context of this redistribution in representative democracies in the West is what they spend the money on. It's usually what we call transfer payments. In other words, consumption. One thing could be said on behalf of the Chinese regime, for example, that when they went into debt, they built physical infrastructure so that when there is a recession or a correction, there's something physical there to show for it. In much of the West, it's just more debt obligations, you know, having to pay people for welfare and so on. So this is one of the problems with the debt being out of control. How to resolve that? Governments can only resolve in the same way that a company can, through default. And that default in the form of government can either be an outright default, say we're not going to pay, or through the price inflation, or through a collapse in the currency, which is more or less equivalent. So we will see one of those sort of, and maybe other things emerge as we try to resolve this 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the debt market.
I would say that it's not a problem of debt. Sometimes it's just a problem of how money is spent. Yep. And the better allocation of money and doing it in an economical way. So sometimes most of the governments usually complain not having enough funding, but they never look at how the money is spent. And if market would try to spend that money, probably they would have been better spent sometimes. Another question, please, and we'll try to conclude.
Good afternoon. Edward Axinte here from the Faculty of Political Science of the University of Bucharest. And I'm more curious in the philosophical aspect of this debate, because I think it is also very important. Put aside the economics issue. So what do you think is what are the causes that led us to the situation in which we have sort of a situation of tribalism in economy? So one group that takes from another group and vice versa. Because, for example, people like Ayn Rand would say that capitalism always lacked a moral foundation. So, for example, early economists like Adam Smith and what came after Adam Smith always interpreted capitalism as a mere, let's call it, as an efficient system, but not as a moral system. So is there where we lost, because the left always claims moral superiority regarding economics, so is there where capitalism lost its grip on government? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I've often been asked, no matter what my topic might be, people want to know, what do you think is the most important issue facing the country or the world? And they expect me to say things like, oh, it's crime, or it's excessive spending, or taxes, or it's COVID, or it's Ukraine, things like that. All of those are important issues. But I always say this, the most important issue in every country at all times is character, personal character. Where do we, how do we come into these intractable problems? I think they stem inevitably from a deterioration in personal character. And by that, I mean things like honesty, speaking truth to power, putting truth on a pedestal and recognizing that it's of great value for its own sake. In other words, we become a dishonest people. That leads to endless problems. I don't see how a dishonest people can even be a free people for very, very long. Another element of character is intellectual humility, recognizing that as much as any of us might know, there's still a universe of knowledge out there that we don't know. What is the most unhumble place in Romania? We may be in it, right? They tend to be, in America, it's Washington, D.C. Why? Because those places are full of people who think they know best how to live your life. We have to get back to the notion that none of us are smart enough to manage the lives of other people. We have a full-time job managing our own. Also, things like responsibility, not blaming others for the consequences of our own poor judgments, courage, patience, gratitude. It all comes down to an individual level. What are the values that we're going to live by? And if we forsake the values of strong personal character, it almost doesn't matter what else we might get right. Because if you don't get character right, nothing else is going to matter. Nothing else is going to work. I don't know of any civilization in all of history that lost its character and kept its liberties. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to dispute, no, go ahead. I just want to dispute the thing about Adam Smith. I mean, I think he's got a better book than Wealth of Nations, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I think that's basically saying that morals and capitalism go hand in hand. I recommend that book. That's pretty good.
Yeah, I wouldn't be comfortable trying to strip morality out of capitalism. Morality is the outcome of human actions. It is individual choices. And capitalism, if you will, is all about the individual. State action is about immoral acts based upon force, compulsion, and so on. So I would be more comfortable saying that politics has no moral base. If we understand human action as the heart of the capitalist process, which is based upon voluntary cooperation, we have to be moral in the eyes of other people for them to cooperate with us. We must be honest. We must carry out our promises. And we must be seen as someone who will not engage in aggression against other people. So the suggestion that there's no moral basis of capitalism is to say that there's no moral basis of humanity. And I would be uncomfortable with that. And as you said, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, not an economist. So it's hard for me to see that he didn't understand the idea of empathy and so
on. Thank you all. I'll just go to the closing remarks. Unfortunately, we are a lot over schedule, so please try to keep the questions for the next panel. It's going to start in less than 3 minutes. We've learned from Mr. President Câțu that sometimes libertarian approach might work, even in small steps, but we have proof of that. We've learned from Larry that we need to have a balanced budget and that fiat currency might be a problem. and Chris told us that we should promote the capacity of individuals and we should focus on that. In the end, I would like to extend my gratitude and thank the President of the Senate, Mr. Kutsu, for hosting us and also for being a speaker in our panel. The organizers, the Austrian Economics Center, and especially to Barbara, who is the heart of it. I would thank the Romanian American University for co-organizing the Free Market Roadshow for a few years. The Ayn Rand Center in Romania as well for being a co-organizer of the Free Market Roadshow. And last but not least, to my colleague Alexandru Butiseacă, who actually brought the Free Market Roadshow for several years in Bucharest and made it possible. Thank you very much. We'll just take a very, very brief 3-minute break, and then we'll start with the next panel, with the second panel. So please don't stay long.
Should we start?
Come on. Okay, please take your seats. We're about to begin. Well, hello everyone. My name is Horia Pauterpe. I'm the director of the Center for Institutional Analysis and Development, Eleuteria, and I have the honor of moderating our second panel for today. Welcome to our continuation of this year Free Market Roadshow Bucharest, which is focusing on the effects of the current overlapping crisis on the global and Romanian economy. We thank the organizers and we thank our hosts for having us today. And in what follows, we are going to enjoy the ideas and the perspectives of an exquisite new panel. I will first introduce the speakers we are going to hear from. First, there is Mr. Cristian Silviu Bușoi, who is the chair of the European Parliament Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, and a medic by profession. Then we are going to move to Mr. Alin Chițu, who is the Secretary of State at the Ministry of Public Finances. He graduated from the Academy of Economic Studies, and he's a fiscal consultant specialized in mergers and acquisitions with a wide experience in administrative development and development of administrative capacities within the states. We are going to continue then, afterwards, with Mr. Nicos Sotirakopoulos from the Ayn Rand Institute. Nicos is a visiting fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute and director of the Ayn Rand Institute Europe. He's also an academic advisor to the Ayn Rand Center in the United Kingdom and the author of Identity Politics and Tribalism, The New Culture Wars, and of the rise of lifestyle activism from New Left to Occupy. Afterwards, we are going to hear from Mr. Simon Sarevsky, who is a bachelor in financial management. He's a research assistant at the Austrian Economic Center and project manager at Libertania, Center for Contemporary Politics, a classical liberal organization based in Macedonia. Before we listen to our speakers' presentations, let me briefly summarize what has been discussed in the previous panel and provide you with a synthesis and with a question. We have seen from all the previous presentations that we must focus on the role of the state in this crisis, which are now overlapping. We heard that the crisis in 2008, the financial crisis, was caused by the expansion of money and credit on the one side and by subsidizing the subprime credits in real estate on the other. In 2020, with the beginning of the COVID crisis, we have witnessed three state monopolies failing successively. The monopoly of public health in China did not manage
to isolate the epidemic where it first began, the international monopoly of the World Health Organization didn't manage to do anything in the first phase, didn't manage to stop the spread, to affect it in anyhow, while the local national public systems have, as you know, been unable to do anything meaningful in the first period, in the first phase of this crisis. We are further confronted with a military conflict in Ukraine, developing nowadays, which would be a third crisis we are discussing. The rest of the crisis, which we're going to come, financials, economic, and so on, recessions maybe, these are consequences. We are noticing that the overall reason, the overall cause for this crisis is the lack of limited government. The governments no longer restrain their actions. The limited government has utterly disappeared, and we have now the temptation of unlimited government going on. In this context, it is important to think in the widest possible terms, and I'm going to remind you of one of the cores in the Aristotelian theory of politics. Aristotle said that governments become corrupt. This means that they degrade into inferior forms of government. He said more exactly that monarchy corrupts into tyranny, aristocracy corrupts into oligarchy, and democracy corrupts into demagogy. The question that I'm addressing to all of you to think about, and to our speakers to maybe give our perspectives on it, is: are we dealing with a historical level, wide-ranging degradation of government? Because if this is the case, the situation is much more serious than we previously believed. In this case, we must expect the continuation of this series of crises with new and new crises. The causation produced by the states and the inability of the states to snap out of this series of crises are ensuring us not so bright future indeed. The last decade, the previous decade, saw one crisis, the economic crisis 2008. Now we already have two crises only at the beginning of the new decade. You see, this is a vicious cycle. This is a cycle in which the solutions to one crisis become the causes for the next one. We are noticing, as a reaction to the two recent crises, an increase in government, in the number of government employees, increases in the budgets, in the state budgets, which are taken out of the economy and redistributed, as the previous speaker said, and the increases in sovereign debt, the increases in monetary mass and credit, that is the inflationary pressure as was earlier defined, right? This is what inflation is. Well, this is my challenge that you think about. How do we get out of this series of crises? There are two theoretical possibilities. One is the incremental one, and the other one is the transitional one. Is there the possibility of incremental measures which would restore limited government? If not, then we are dealing with a transition from a political system to a different political system. The matter with these transitions is that they are either short and violent, such as revolutions, or they are very, very long and incremental, such as, for instance, the transition from antiquity to the Magna Carta. We had a degradation of democracy in antiquity, which was later on revived through Magna Carta into the Renaissance. But it took hundreds of years, and Magna Carta was only the beginning of the new democracy. With these thoughts, I'm going to spend no more time and give the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Cristian Boucher.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to say that I'm honored to be here. As a member of European Parliament and chairman of Industry, Research and Energy Committee, I will try to give a general overview on how this crisis and the impact of first COVID-19 and now the war in Ukraine have on European economic system. I saw in the first part of the discussion that we also had a lot of philosophical interrogations, questions, and also looking to the situation from a libertarian perspective. And I agree in principle that we need to be aware and to be attentive that this crisis should not lead to even more intervention of the states on economy. But of course, what is also extremely important is to find the right solutions to the crisis. And I can tell you that now in European Parliament, worries about geopolitical conflicts, among other risks to growth and economical wealth, exceed the concerns about the COVID-19 pandemic, which were the most relevant until the beginning of this year. And I also must say that the overall economic optimism continues to decline. Last year, we experienced the effects of new variants of the COVID-19 virus and a surge in diagnosed cases at large in late 2021. We also witnessed the misinformation and the resistance to vaccinations campaigns that caused the resurgence of renewed calls for lockdowns and curfews. This all, of course, threatened to weaken and delay the potential sustained economic recovery into late 2021 and the start of 2022. We have seen also during the pandemic major effects of different sectors of the economy. And we had a long discussion and a study in the committee that I'm chairing, ITRE Committee in European Parliament, and we analyzes the impact on particularly the service sector, HoReCa sector, the tourism sector, and also we discussed a lot about unions' dependencies on external supply chains that contributed to disruptions along the whole supply chain and to a high range of sectors. The conclusion is that we need a more ambitious and a stronger industrial policy in European Union. We need an industrial policy which even promote more the competitiveness that should create jobs and guarantee a high quality of life. And also EU must support in the near future the development of those sectors that are of strategic importance for Europe's industrial future. So beside the twin transition, the Green Deal and the digital transformation of our industries, we need to pay more attention on the health system and the resilience of our health systems, and of course on those sectors where our current dependencies could aggravate future crises. We also have experienced dislocation of labor of certain population groups, and these groups are still recovering and are at risk. But of course, we should also acknowledge the fact that during the pandemic, the economies have made progresses in vaccination, growing shares of population. Most of the European countries, if not all, were kept the population safe as much as it was possible during the peaks of the pandemic, and most of European countries invested a lot on health. That's why the recovery came later, raising prospects of sustained economic recovery in late 2021 and 2022. And most of the economists were convergent to say that prior to the outbreak of the war, most key global macroeconomic variables were seen as returning to normality over 2022-2023 following the COVID-19 pandemic. Most economies were expected to get back on track to employment, to phase out different fiscal emergency policies, to starting to apply new monetary policies from 2023, and inflation was seen as converging on levels close to policy objectives, took later and from higher levels than previously expected in most countries. Prior to the conflict, the global recovery from the pandemic was expected to continue in 2022 and 2023, also helped by continued progress with global vaccination efforts, supportive macroeconomic policies, and favorable financial conditions. And at the level of European Union, we have adopted the Resilience and Recovery Facility, RRF, and each country has made their national recovery plans with robust investments exactly in the sector needed to boost the recovery. And then all of us, we witnessed the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the criminal invasion and the criminal attack by Russia. The most important consequences of the war in Ukraine is, of course, the lives lost and the humanitarian crisis associated with the huge numbers of besieged and displaced people. But there are also numerous significant economic implications, and these come on top on what we have experienced and still are the effects of the 2-year pandemic. The war in Ukraine has created a negative supply shock for the world economy, just when some of the supply chain challenges seen since the beginning of the pandemic appeared to be starting to fade. The effects of the war will operate through many different channels and are likely to evolve if the conflict deepens further. We'll see all the effects in years. In some respects, of course, the direct role of Russia and Ukraine in the global economy is small. But on the other hand, Russia and Ukraine do have an important influence on the global economy, and this is via their role as major suppliers in a number of commodity markets. I just remind you that Russia and Ukraine together account for about 30% of global exports of wheat, 20% for corn, mineral fertilizers and natural gas, and 11% for oil. In addition, supply chains around the world are dependent on exports of metals from Russia and Ukraine. Russia is a key supplier of palladium, used in catalytic converters for cars, and nickel, used in steel production and manufacturing of batteries. Russia and Ukraine are also sources of inert gases such as argon and neon, used in the production of semiconductors. We already experienced before the war a big problem with chips, semiconductors, and large producers of titanium sponge used in aircraft. Both countries also have globally important reserves of uranium. So the prices of many of these commodities have increased sharply since the onset of the war, even in the absence of any significant disruption of production or export volumes at the beginning. Another major impact is the rise of the price of energy. We have to be honest and recognize that the prices of energy were already high before the conflict, with its peak last December, due to decrease of production inside European Union, to the increase of demand on international markets, and especially in Asia, and of course especially in China, also due to the reduce of production due to problems with the wind in some of European countries, but was also the result of the Green Deal policies in a small extent, but significant, and of course the result of the play of the game that Gazprom made last year in order to gain profits and strengthen the dependence of some of European countries on the Russian gas. Because energy has been used for geopolitical purposes by Russia for a long time. But now the situation risks to be worsened. That's why European Union decided, and it was one of the main conclusions at the Versailles summit of the heads of states and government, to take decisive measures to reduce as much as possible the vulnerability of our systems against the shock waves of the war. And we decided strategically to make Europe independent from Russian gas. And this decision not only makes sense in the context of the Russian aggression of Ukraine, but also in the long-term economic and environmental sense of less dependence and more strategic autonomy. I will finish by saying that it is very likely that 2022 will be complicated for European Union and for Romania. But every crisis has its opportunities also. We have the opportunity to accelerate the Green Deal, the transition versus clean energy, clean transport, cleaner industrial sector, and cleaner agriculture, and also to deepen the digitalization of our societies. We have the opportunity to gain more strategic autonomy. We have the opportunity also to build more industrial capabilities in the area of energy, health, semiconductors, raw materials, and other key strategic industrial sectors which are key for the future generations. Thank you so much once again for the invitation, and please excuse me that at 1:30, as it was supposed to end this event, I will really have to go for the next event of today. Thank you so much. All right, we benefit from this mobile mic, and I'm going to invite Mr. Alinchi to take the floor. And yes, we benefited from hearing about the European economy, and now we are going to focus on the Romanian one even more.
Well, isn't this a lovely and wonderful room to have discussions as today? Well, as everybody ahead of me, I need to thank everybody for inviting me. I prepared some words here because I'm not very used to having such presentations, and having such wonderful speakers before me is an endeavor by itself to have a speech. So for a while now, I have the honor to serve as a state secretary within the Romanian Ministry of Finance, and this allowed me to grasp a different understanding on economy deriving from a public perspective, as this is my first job in the public sector. And it is 1 year and 3 months, and I'm counting the days, and it's, as I said, a privilege and an honor to do this. So I had the chance to witness firsthand and reconfirm that the fact that the EU is undeniable, one of the main pillars of freedom and democracy, and that stronger together is not just a slogan. At EU level, we managed to have the best deployment of vaccines in the world. And further on, in order to tackle the effects of the COVID crisis, we managed to draft and agree the first real 5-year plan in ages for Romania, with the support of our EU fellow member states, having at its core the vision of digitalizing, going greener, and development, embraced by everybody. Also, we learned that Romania lacks the third international pillar of development in our global connection to like-minded countries beside NATO and the EU, and thus we enforced our commitment to the OECD principles, and we have been officially invited to start the process to further develop and strengthen our economic cooperation with this elite club of mostly economically developed countries, not to use the term used by the economists, a club of mostly rich countries, to be politically correct. Further on, during the COVID crisis, we rediscovered the basic economic principles stating that the market, the entrepreneurs, and business at all levels know better how to use the money. Simple but fast deployed measures like accelerating the VAT reimbursement, rescheduling of tax obligation, paying the public investments in due time resulted in a fast recovery during 2021. This is a lesson showing that pinpointing measures requiring high administrative costs from taxpayers' money, lengthy designing process, and slow-paced deployment are not really necessary. Going further, the trustworthiness structure on fiscal discipline pays off really fast. And as a result, Romania joined the select club of countries who manage the issuance of negative interest rate debt. And we were able to fuel the above-mentioned decisions on lower costs. Both private and public sectors learned that we can speed up the pace of going digital. And 2 years after starting the long-due digitalization marathon, we brought online most of taxpayer services, started the standard audit file and the invoicing, as well as connecting approximately 600,000 cash registers to tax authorities' internet site. And then we are coming to the energy crisis and, well, connected to the war crisis. This re-energized the focus on efficiency. It emphasized the very good connection of the markets, of the energy markets in financial terms, but a lesser degree of physical connectivity globally and especially at the level of the internal market. And also emphasized the need for bold measures requiring for tackling the temporary market inefficiencies. We need to be fair and set the objective of fast and fair distribute the available resources without deviating from our assumed fiscal discipline. This potentially means the unpopular position of acknowledging that at the end of the day, the taxpayers are those supporting the costs, either directly, either indirectly by increased inflation or taxes. And now I get to the war. And the war and the related crisis is teaching us once more that the road to unfreedom is paved with demagogy and populism. We did not reach the end of history as some predict yet. Globalization based on competition and free markets helped peace and most of the liberal countries to be the source of the entire world development. Nevertheless, the main beneficiary in financial terms of the global liberal international order seems to be China. Unfortunately, it seems that liberal principle and the liberal international order failed to spiritually develop sufficiently in the Russian people's minds. It also brought an accelerated development and the subsequent generated fatigue left behind results. This brings the inequality issue at a global level. But still, the war reminded us the force of like-minded democratic countries, the force of shaping societies and institutions on common principles. It shows us the courage of being able to take financial hits for the sake of keeping our liberal way of life. Continuing to embrace the liberal order on a global level or under the West and the rest manner is a question that needs to be addressed properly and with consideration to the crisis fatigue that we are facing. Brexit, COVID, energy prices, and now war brought an extreme pressure on our citizens' way of life, but there is no other better alternative to our democratic and liberal principle. And to end this 15 minutes of fame, and thank you for granting this 15 minutes, I don't know what the future may continue to bring, but if there is an obvious and perhaps simplistic takeaway for Romania of the very recent history is that we ended up stronger in defending such principle alongside our fellow free market supporters. Thank you.
We thank very much our last two speakers for focusing our attention on the public economies, both the European and the Romanian one. And it is very interesting that we can think about all the subject of our conference as the interplay between private and public economies at the different levels of aggregation. We are going to move on now and ask Mr. Simon Sarevski to take the floor.
Hello, everybody, and I would like to thank you all for coming and joining us today at the Free Market Roadshow, both in my name and at the name of the Austrian Economic Center. First, I will talk a little bit about inflation. As our speakers previously mentioned, we have consumer price inflation and we have non-price inflation. I will stick to the price inflation. For example, today the price inflation in the US is 7.9 year by year, and that is a really, really big number. The US has not seen such number in more than 40 years, and at the same time, the inflation is even bigger because there is something economists call skimflation, and that's in a sense the way the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is measured. It measures a product and the same product year by year. But what if the producer sells you the product for the same amount of money, but at the same time they sell you a little bit less? So imagine a Coca-Cola that was half a liter, now it's 450 milliliters. The thing is, the inflation would say there is no inflation. However, you obviously paid more because the consumer is more price conscious than let's say weight conscious. That's why the companies do that when they can get away with it, and this has happened especially during the COVID crisis. So the official inflation rate is a lot bigger than the 7.9 when you manage to calculate that. However, the problem is you cannot measure that because there are like so many products, more than 80,000, that measure inflation. The same thing, which economists call is skimflation, besides the shrinkflation, is, for example, when you get like worse service because all of a sudden, because the price of labor is higher. Imagine you are flying a long flight. Instead of having like 4 flight attendants, you are having 3 flight attendants. What this means is you get less service, and even though you have paid the same price for the ticket, and even if the official inflation rate says there is zero inflation, you obviously paid more. However, this is something that cannot be calculated. So the inflation is far bigger than the official numbers say, even if the people that are calculating the inflation don't want to lie to us, which technically they are not. But those are the constraints of the inflation numbers. So when we think about inflation, even a double-digit inflation rate, it's not a big deal if you do it only for like 2 or 3 years, because think of it in a way, you have like a car accident and you have to, I don't know, spend a lot of money for this year to repair the car, or a medical bill, or something that's like big expenditure. You have saved a lot of money for such events, and yes, it's uncomfortable to pay them, I don't know, once, twice, or 3 times every year, but that ends. But the problem with such big inflation numbers is, the problem is not if you get the job, but what if you lose the job? And during double-digit inflation times, like what was in the 70s and the 80s, a lot of people lose the job. So yes, if you still have the job, a 10% inflation can be okay, but the problem is a lot of people lose their job. So inflation goes way deeper than that. But then we think why this inflation happened. So who do we blame for this? Well, one part is, as again the previous Larry talked about, the money supply. The money supply has been rising a lot during from the start of the inflation. I believe it was in the first 12 or 13 months after the 1st of March, when the official coronavirus came into the United States, more than 39% of all the US dollars in existence were printed, in the US. So obviously there is a time lag, and that is why we are seeing the inflation right now. But the thing is, we know who to blame. That's one part is the monetary policy. The second part is the fiscal policy, because look at the budget deficits both during the Republican and the Democrat term during Corona. They are like skyrocketing, and if you thought that the budget deficits during the 2007-2008 crisis were big, we were obviously wrong, because there is no stop to how much governments can borrow. So what is the problem with this? Even balanced budget, if we start them today, they will not be enough, it seems, because we have borrowed so much, and a lot of money has to be spent just to stay afloat, you know, and that is a big problem. At the same time, we have spent a lot of money, and we have created a lot of money. So when the next real recession comes, you know, a recession from, you know, economic terms, how are we gonna manage to get out of it? Because what is usually, you know, either fiscal policy or monetary policy, they're out of the question, because we have done that now before the recession. So I believe that the government's hands will be tied, and that is the big picture problem, because there is no real way out of the next big recession. And when will it come? As Larry said, probably end of this year, maybe early next year. I don't know, but I believed that such inflation, such a recession would come even if we did not have COVID in the year that was coming or so. COVID came, so I was wrong, and I cannot predict this, but at the same time, I do fear the next big recession at the same time, because the hands of the government will be tied. So that's one part of the topic. The more important part maybe is, how do we grow rich? How do we grow more prosperous than yesterday? That's what every government in history has tried to do, be it a monarchy or a republic or a democracy, or however you want to put it. And the point is, we forget what made the West rich. Until the 17th century, everybody was poor in the world, and there was like a fixed pie fallacy. I take from you because there is enough pie, and if I eat more of it, or if you eat more of the pie, there is less for me. Then we started developing with free markets, with private property. We put development first, and now especially I would say in the Western Europe, we are not that into development, but more into redistribution. If you look at, for example, the discretionary and non-discretionary budget of the US, the discretionary part, which means the part that was meant for development, let's say infrastructure, etc., and not like social security and healthcare and pensions. That was 2/3 of the whole budget. Today, that's 1/3. And this is like a transition in the past 50 or 60 years. What this means is more and more money we are paying on redistribution, and less money we are paying on development, whatever that development might be. And again, it can be roads, and we know by definition how, and by by theory, that central planning does not work. The 20th century communist approaches, experiments told us, again, in practice, that central planning does not work and cannot work. And unlike my previous colleagues, I wouldn't say that we need to go to a 5-year plan or 10-year plan, because the 5-year plan always reminds me of the Soviet Union and how they tried from the get-go to have like some big grand structure done in the 5 years. What we need is to let people, you know, produce, provide, and work more. We need more entrepreneurship, and we need to let people, especially again entrepreneurs, imagine the next world, and let them try to create it. Yes, it does not always work, but it's way better than it works more often than if we let the government try to do that 5-year plan creation. And think of it in COVID times, for example. I remember the PwC, the accounting firm, allowed all, because they saw how efficient their employees were working from home. They said, okay, from now on, we are going to allow, even post-crisis, allow all of our workers to work from home. So imagine imagine that the government, because of their 5-year plan, says, no, this is not efficient, blah, 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 whatever the reason they might give. The problem is, unless the entrepreneurs tried that new approach, we will never know whether it was better or not. And we know that with governments, it takes long time to find the problem and fix the problem, because driven by the profit motive, entrepreneurs will fix. Imagine that the PwC are wrong about this. What they're going to do? Wait for the 5-year plan of the government to tell them they were wrong? No, they will, driven by the profit motive, they will just give up. And Thomas Sowell always says there are no solutions, there are trade-offs. And this is again very important, I believe, right now, because there is, first and foremost, there is no one-size-fits-all solution in a single country, let alone a confederation or a federation, which the European Union is neither and both at the same time. How do you do a one-size-fits-all monetary policy in the EU when with so many different economies that are structured in a different way? The southern countries have more tourism, unlike Germany, for example, and they still have the same monetary policy when the crisis comes. And there is like the big problem that we don't have real solution, and the only one is the trade-off. And what are we trading off? And again, we use a lot of green energy, clean this, clean that, sustainable energy, and those are only buzzwords that get like the popular vote and elect politicians, but this is not what creates prosperity and wealth. Because imagine this, again, if people really wanted cleaner energy, and that cleaner energy was more expensive, they would have already not voted people, but they would have bought the cleaner, more expensive energy, for the sake of argument. The thing is, we don't need the governments to tell us that we need green energy, because if we really wanted that green energy, we were already gonna pay the higher price. And I think that the energy crisis that is happening right now is telling us that obviously the people do not want that much green energy or at least as much as it's proposed that they want, because they have to pay higher price. And obviously higher prices might be acceptable if they're like $10 a month more, but if they become like 50 or 100, then you have a big problem. And there is that trade-off that politicians do not allow us to choose, but always give us in our name, because they know everything. I always say, if there was Mordor in the world, it would be Washington DC and Brussels in Europe. So government hands are tied. The only big solution, I would say, even though, as I've said, there are no solutions, would be technology. And imagine, again, this goes back to inflation. Imagine like 50 years ago, how much the car costed, and how much buying a car now costs. Probably in work hours, it costs a little bit less, but at the same time, we are driving such a, far better cars. Think of the COVID time. We had a lot of kids learning, going to school from home. 15 years ago, that was not possible. Everybody was watching Netflix, and hanging out online, etc., etc. But 15 years ago, that was again not possible, and this is, I don't know where technology will bring us. I don't know how much technology will change our lives and will better our lives, and technically will bring inflation down, and technically we are getting more for our work. But the only solution, I would say, I see in the near future is technology bringing us forward. And technology to bring us forward with a more prosperous life is only if we let entrepreneurs and the free market work. So thank you.
We thank you very much, Simon. As you can see, our current session is a real debate. in which the public economy and the private economies are interacting in our ideas. We are going to go further on to our last speaker, Mr. Nicos Sotirakopoulos from the Ayn Rand Institute.
Thank you very much. So first of all, how cool is it that we are in Ceausescu's People's Palace and we have a free market roadshow? Sometimes, the good guys win. So in the next 5 minutes, I have a very difficult mission, which is among politicians and economists to persuade you that the biggest problem we face doesn't come from politics, doesn't come from economy, but it comes from the way we think. I don't want to use big words like philosophy, but mostly from this idea we have that principles is this thing that doesn't work in real life. We have our principles when we meet each other and we have a wine and we say, oh, these are my principles. But then, in a time of importance, the adults in the room intervene and they'll say, let's get away with principles and do what works. The question is, what works based on what, if not our principles? So let me give you some examples. We've completely given away the idea that there are causes and effects. For example, we're going to print 5 trillion, but there's going to be no inflation. Why? Well, we figured it out, because we want it. Or, and hopefully I won't disappoint some people, we're going to give up cheap, plentiful, and reliable energy. Sorry, this is fossil fuels. And somehow we're going to not have any energy problem. Our bills are not going to go up, and we're going to have a lot of energy. Or, if we're generally, we're going to give up nuclear, and we are going to trust a thuggish regime for our energy needs, but this regime is not going to act in this thuggish way. Why? Because we want it. So we place a want above an is, and then we wonder why we are in this crisis. But I don't want to do the popular libertarian thing, which is to blame politicians, because the truth is that for most of the things they did, the population agreed 100%. They requested more lockdowns, or when a 16-year-old was going from establishment institution to establishment institution, lecturing us how we're very bad for not switching to green energy, we were all saying, yes, something needs to be done. And then we wonder, why does my energy bill go up? So quite often, the first people who betray these ideas that we claim that we believe are people within the freedom movement or liberals or however you want to call it. Listen to this tweet, which was tweeted at the beginning of the pandemic by one of the most popular classical liberals on Twitter. I don't know reason to name names. So she says, quote, "In good times, I am a centrist libertarian, but in hard times, I am a pragmatist. Whether it's the nationalization of utilities, Keynesian stimulus, quarantine and surveillance, if it works, do it. Scale it back later." Now, this is actually why we're losing. This is actually why we keep going to losing. Because we don't understand that the ideas we believe in are actually guides to action. And if they're not guides to action, throw them away. You need new ideas, you need new principles. Principles are not this, oh, I have this cool suit for a Sunday morning when it's sunny, but when it's rainy, I throw it away. Then you need new ideas. So, as Ayn Rand would say, which I think more people need to read, you have to check your premises when you see that your premises don't correspond to reality. So, let's test it out. Did the ideas of freedom operate during the pandemic? And the answer is yes, of course they did. Who gave us the vaccine? Moderna had the vaccine ready within 48 hours from when they got the genome, the sequence. And we got it in our hands months and months later because, again, we had to go through all the protocols. In the meantime, people died. They couldn't decide for themselves whether they would take the risk with the vaccine. Someone else had to decide for them. Or do you remember the fiasco with the tests in the United States at the beginning of the pandemic? These days, we can find the test in a grocery store. But in the first months, the powers to be said that no, there's this only one approved test, which means that most people didn't have a test. So I don't want to say much more. I think it's, in a crisis, the stakes are even higher. So in a crisis, that's where we have to go to the barricades for ideas. That's where we have to go to the barricades and say, no, it's let people decide and let people be free to pursue actions. That's more important than when we are in a time of prosperity and we just discuss it. So I will leave you with this. Let's take ideas seriously, because ideas matter and ideas have consequences. It's ideas actually that made this building and made this horrendous regime that brought it up. It's ideas that had people all over the world defend it, and it's ideas that brought it down. So hopefully next time there is a crisis, we're going to realize that let's stick to our principles and let's not throw them away so easily. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nicos. This concludes our speakers' interventions, and the immense food for thought they offered you is now open for questions. Please, yes, please use the microphones there. Microphone number 2.
Hello, pardon.
No, go ahead.
I have a question regarding green energy, because it was a subject many speakers touched upon. To start, I want to say that there are no clear estimates about how much pollution costs us. We have estimates from very interested parties. I have right here a research from Greenpeace that says that about 1.8 billion days of work absence are caused by pollution. And I wanted to ask the speakers if they think that green energy is a lot more expensive than other types of energy, because some of the costs inherent in polluting energy are not factored in.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to?
I think all of us. No, here it's fine, but yes, I'll give to Nicos. Okay. First of all, it is difficult to estimate the costs. It will be always a controversy, but it was also a study backed by European Parliament called Cost of Non-Action, what it would be the impact on the society, or European economies and societies, if we do not take action and if we do not go in the direction of decarbonization and Green Deal. And experts, and it was also accepted by most of the European Parliament members, was that the cost is higher if we look to the impact of the climate change on our lives and our economies. On the cost of the green energy itself, of course, at the beginning, the cost is very high. This is what we experienced first with the solar energy and wind energy. And now the situation is much different when the market is mature and when the right incentives for investments were sent. But at the beginning, it's clear that you need these incentives, be it state aids, policies, price for carbon, because this is also an important incentive in order to go in this direction. Now the same discussion is with hydrogen or other technologies of the future, the carbon capture technologies, but you will see in some years that this also will become affordable technologies. What I plea in European Parliament is to find the right balance. We should go in this direction, we should pursue our objectives. It is clear that the new generation everywhere in the world would like to go in this direction, to not to see pollution and to mitigate climate change, but in the same time we should propose feasible actions, feasible solutions. We should not jeopardize the competitiveness of our industries and not lose jobs, especially in time of crisis. And if we can find the right balance, then I think we could succeed.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, indeed, it is a problem. Climate change is a problem. Health issues is a problem. So the first thing that we would need to do with energy is to understand that without cheap and reliable energy, there is no industry. It's like the bloodstream. It's the industry that makes every other industry possible. So before we place limitations on it, we have to be very, very careful on what we're doing. And particularly when it comes to developing countries, where energy poverty is actually a health issue and an issue that has to do with the prospect of these lives. I think it's unacceptable from us Westerners going to these countries and saying, no, you're not going to have this one opportunity to develop that we all had. So let me return the question to you as food for thought. If it was indeed the cheaper and the most efficient, why would it need all the incentives? Why would it need all the subsidies? And why would it need all the measures against everything else? Imagine me telling you, the iPhone is a great thing, therefore I'm going to stop Samsung or any other company from selling their phones in their own price, and I'm going to subsidize you £500 to buy the iPhone. But the iPhone is the most reliable and cheap. Doesn't make sense.
Right. Well, thank you. Sorry.
So I technically have no idea about the costs, and I think that Nicos kind of said what had to be said, but I would go a bit different way. What if climate change really melts a lot of the ice, and then a lot of people have to be displaced, and they cannot live on the shores anymore? Sure, that's gonna happen. That's a thing. Let's say that happens, but at the same time, that same warmer weather will make a lot of places that were practically uninhabitable before open for a lot of people. And if you look at the map and calculate with a bit more water in the instead of ice caps, we will have more places, more place to live. Now, I'm not saying that this is good, but all I'm saying is we have so many variables that we have to think about when we are discussing climate change, especially with the energy prices, and how much we are prepared to pay. At the same time, this very much depends on a developed country and a poor country. So it's not like simple solution. Oh, we want to go green. Everybody wants to go green. Yes, even so. Even if you say 100% of the people want to go green, they don't want to go green. There is a scale from 1 to 10, and again, we are only discussing a one-size-fits-all solution on a global scale with more than 7 billion people and how many countries, which I think makes this approach very problematic to solve.
So, a very good answer. I remember I read somewhere that, in fact, Europe only accounts for about 7% of global pollution, which means that other places in the world, which are in different stages of development, should be treated differently. We're going now to the next question, please.
Sorry, one other thing before the next question regarding the percentage. The thing is, China, for example, in 2021 had around 26% of the global green CO2 emissions, or something along those lines. I don't remember the numbers exactly. However, if you look at per capita pollution, the developed countries pollute the world way more. So then again comes the question, do we care about the country or do we care about per capita pollution? And I would say per capita pollution is more important. And here the West spends more on everything that pollutes. So should they be taxed more? These are questions that when you ask them, when you ask the questions the correct way, in a sense, because you pollute more, you should pay more. I think that then the answer, even if I said 100% would agree for green energy, then that percent will dramatically fall when they have to pay the price. Because without skin in the game, everybody is for green energy. With skin in the game, everything changes.
Thank you. Please.
I'm Antonia from Romanian American University, and I have some various questions for our speakers. Will be consequences for Romania because of the war between Ukraine and Russia?
In what sense?
in the sense that our country will support some consequences of this war between these countries?
I will shortly answer because it's a general question, and then please allow me to leave because I want to be on time on the next commitment. But my co-panelists distinguished with a very interesting and challenging interventions. I'm sure it will continue to keep the interest of audience very high. Well, it is clear that there are consequences. This is something, how these consequences and what will be the scale of these consequences is still not clear because you don't know the length and the intensity of the war. First of all, of course, there is the migration crisis and there is already costs for our economy and our budget, but we have to do this, we have to show solidarity. Then, of course, it is the price of energy, which, as I said, was already high before, but will be, if not exacerbated, at least maintained due to, this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine, it's a criminal aggression of Russia against Ukraine, which, of course, leads now to war crimes and very, very, very deep humanitarian crisis. So in the energy area, it is very clear, and all the other consequences of the supply chains and the crisis of raw materials, the agriculture crisis, or at least problems in agriculture will be clearly experienced by whole Central East Europe and, of course, by Romania. And we will have to increase our expenses in the defense area, which is not a bad thing. It is an opportunity for our defense industry, for European defense industry also. But of course, we'll have to see from where we can cut the costs, because we will not intend to increase taxes in Romania in the coming period.
Thank you very much.
Okay, the next question that I have, do you think Romania is ready for another possible version of the COVID virus?
Nobody is really ready for this, but we should take into account what is now the situation in China, for instance, worries a lot. The specialists, the epidemiologists, let's see. Personally, I don't believe that we will experience what we experienced in the past, but of course, new variants of COVID or other health crises could appear in the near future.
What is missing in Romania economy to become like the strongest economies of the world?
Well, I think you're better here, a better place to answer to this, but well, it's a very, very long answer, and yes, she's very young.
It is really hard to answer all that it needs, but our main focus should be on how pro-free market the main institutions are. Thus, if you're thinking of the institutions at the three level, constitutional, collective, and operational, all of this should allow the unhindered creation of prosperity, continuous creation of prosperity, and successive capitalization on it. This, combined with a limited government, should do the trick in the not so near future. But
because again, sometimes the answer is simpler than we think. So who creates these things? People with ideas and people who put them in action. So I would say it might sound simple, but let them create. You have a great idea, you should be free to do it. Someone thought of Uber, for example. Uber happened, many people found a job. Someone thought of the iPhone. He was free to come together with other people, and they created something that changed our lives. So there is not, quite often we want to think there's this very complicated formula. We raise tax 1%, we put tariffs down 2%. Simple. Let people create, let people follow their purpose, their dreams, and things are gonna be well. This is how it has happened forever, and this is how it will always happen. So I will disagree with my co-panelists. The answer is very simple rather than very complicated.
Great. Okay. Do you still have more questions, or can we go on?
I have two last questions.
Okay, ask them at the same time, please.
Okay. Do you think that this war with Ukraine will somehow affect the Russian economy on the long term?
And the second question?
And the second question, do you think that Ukraine economy will be stable in the near future after the war will end, of course?
So on the Russia question, the answer is yes, but not only because of the war, because their economy is based on deals, on who is a friend of whom, and it's based on the fact that they happen to have natural resources, and this, they don't have an incentive to open their economy. But life comes at you fast, so if they don't open their economy, it's not the war that is going to ruin them, but the war is going to bring this sooner. With Ukraine, I'm more optimist because, again, it's on their hand to realize that if they fight the war in the name of freedom, they should live up to this value and allow freedom also to operate in peacetime, and then things will be good.
So, thank you very much. Thanks very much. We're going further on to mic number 2.
Well, first of all, thank you for the presentations. It's been quite an insightful morning. We have definitely faced some rough times, and we keep battling new and new challenges as we speak. Because be the global pandemic or the atrocities that are happening across borders, the business ecosystem has suffered a lot, and it still needs to keep adjusting, adapting, and sorry, I'm not used to this, and becoming more and more flexible. So my question relates to the opportunities that some of you have spoken about today. So if you were to look at just one opportunity, what do you think is that opportunity that a business should grab right now in order to keep meeting the needs of the consumers while also keep the profits coming? Thank you.
Advocate for cheaper energy. And this doesn't happen, again, it was mentioned that before the war, sorry?
Smaller businesses, so below, I don't know, 5 million revenue?
But this is something that affects everyone. Because it was mentioned that even before the war, energy prices went up. How? Was like a natural phenomenon, like the weather. No, they went up based on our policies. So the most important thing is to realize, let's not be suckers again and say, okay, maybe we need higher taxes. So whether it's a small business or a big business, their message should be, look, we had all this pressure on us in these 2 years, now leave us alone. Get out of the way. Again, might sound simplistic, but I can't think of a single better thing for small businesses. Get out of the way in the sphere of energy. Get out of the way in the sphere of letting us choose how we hire, how we fire, how we run our business. That's the best thing a business can do, whether it's big or small. Simon, what do you think?
I would definitely agree with Nicos. I would add one other thing. For example, US is a really good example of occupational licensing. So you cannot braid a hair unless you have a license. And to get a license, you need in some states to pass through I don't know, pay, let's say $100, $200, spend 20 hours getting the license, etc., etc. And when you combine all those costs, opportunity cost of getting license, some of the people don't do that. And imagine this on a whole wide level with so many licenses for pretty much everything. This makes a more administrative state instead of entrepreneurial state. Look at the universities, for example. You don't have more students, but you have more costs per student. Why? You don't have more professors at the same time. So why does this happen? Because you have a lot of administration, because everybody has to fill a form for this, for that. And these are really good examples that pop into your mind. You know, you need less rules, not because we are gonna be killed by or hurt somehow by I don't know, people that braid hair without a license. We need less rules because it will be more efficient. At the same time, some people who value, I don't know, the license of the I don't know, hair braider would go there and pay the higher price, and that's fine. But someone like me who does not care will pay the lower price. And again, on the whole economy, this has a lot of costs, and the more we allow businesses to work free, the better economies will grow. I believe that even this is even more so than lowering taxes at some point.
I thank you both for the question and our speakers for the answers. Their general answer is to your question is that you should advocate for the lowering of all costs throughout the economy, be they energy, licensing, and taxation, and so on, which would make most or every opportunity more valuable.
This is what we said previously. The moral is the practical. We don't like the ideas of freedom because they invite us to talk. It's because when you apply them, your life becomes better. And when your life is better, my life is going to be better because we trade. So that's a good way to show that if the ideas don't work in action, throw them away. Theory is what you recognize what happens in life and you explain it. It's not like, oh, I have a theory. So, but good luck if you are a small business owner in this environment. You have all my respect.
Thank you. We are moving to the next question with the mic number 3.
Okay, so I had a question for the, but he left, so I don't know who is going to be capable to answer my
Can you speak louder, please?
Yeah, so I said I had a question for him, but he left, so he was kind of more pleased to answer my question because he's from the European Parliament. So my question would be, he mentioned something in his speech regarding Russian isolation. So my question is, did they really think about isolating Russia now? Or that is something that was in, before, even before they started aggressing Ukraine? So is it something that they have always had in mind, or it is something that actually came just now? Because from recent history or all the evidence that we have, it is not something that Europe has been doing, that Europe is thinking about doing. It is something that Europe has been doing, so why?
That's an excellent question, and I will slightly change it. Why hasn't they done this already? What do you expect from dealing with Putin? Or let me change it. What do you expect when you deal with someone who is violent, unreliable, and you don't know what's going to happen the next day? You don't have anything to gain when you deal with bad people. The same applies when you deal with bad regimes. Soviet Union, for example, all these Westerners would go there and invest and then say, oh, they nationalized my property. Well, what did you expect? The Q is in the title, Soviet Union. So I would say something similar with Russia. You should not rely on Putin for your energy needs. And you shouldn't rely 10 years ago because the signs were there. You could see political opposition disappearing. You could see aggression. You could see things that should really make you think, do I want to deal with that person? And I would say this even in real life. Us as individuals, do we have anything to earn by dealing with people who are not good? I would say no. Or you might earn something today and you might lose it even worse in 3 months. So my question is why did Europe wait now to start asking questions? Maybe we should start cutting ties with this guy.
This is funny because I wholeheartedly disagree with Nicos, because it's not that I blame the West for the war in Russia, in Ukraine. However, I blame the West for not going halfway and being friendly enough, because yes, we don't like Putin for all the reasons. We agree with Nicos about why we don't like Putin for sure. However, I believe that the West did not extend the hand and went halfway. And yes, at the end of the day, Putin maybe was not elected properly in a democratic way, as we in the West would say he should have been. However, people who experience economic growth, who go to the middle classes, will not accept the regime as it is now. And if, for example, Russia managed to grow richer and richer, especially with all the resources that they have, I believe if that translated into a stronger middle class and people seeing how the Western model works more would have accepted, not accepted, would have turned away from Putin. I don't know whether it would have been 1 year, 5 years, or 15 years, but he already is in power for more than 20 years. So I blame the West in a sense, and I say this comparing to 87 when Ronald Reagan stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate and he did not say, Mr. Gorbachev, I'm going to bring my army and tear down the wall. He asked Mr. Gorbachev to tear down the wall. And I think that was like a genuine extension of the hand into a friendship, let's say, that 2 years later, the people saw and brought down the wall, and 4 years afterwards was the end of the Soviet Union. So I blame the West for not being friendly enough.
Money by the IMF, we gave them the World Cup, the Winter Olympics. If this doesn't sound friendly, I don't know what friendly is. But
It seems the friendship which started in 1990 ended in 2015, no? When Crimea was. All right, let's go to the next question.
I'm Joy Oabamua from Romanian American University. So Chris earlier mentioned that we're facing a crisis of leadership. So from that, I want to ask, what effect does corruption have in bringing up inflation and the recession?
That's an excellent question. What's the effect?
What effect does corruption have in inflation? Like, how does corruption in a country, having corrupt leaders, how does it affect inflation and the recession?
It's an excellent question.
So, I come from a country where, I'm from Greece, where we've had the crisis, and the theory was that it's because our politicians are corrupt. So the idea was we made the Olympic Games, and they costed a lot of money, and some of that money ended up in the pockets of politicians. Turns out the Olympic Games cost to Greece the equivalent of half a year of what we pay in pensions and insurance. So I'm more afraid not of the corrupt politicians, but of the politicians who do what they promise to their electorate. So for 3 decades, we Greeks were asking, look, we want to work for the state as little as possible and get as much money as possible. And our politicians said, yes, we're going to do that. And they did exactly that. If you want to see democracy in action, look Greece in the 80s and in the 90s. And what was the result? A big crisis. So corruption is a problem. And corruption, particularly when you combine it with an unfree regime like Russia, can mean even things like if you're not corrupted enough, you might end in prison. So it's something very, very bad. At the same time, quite often we overestimate the role that corruption plays in a country going downhill. So it is a problem, but it's not, in my view, as big a problem as bad policies. And even worse, as bad policies that the people who promote them are convinced that are the best policies. So what do you think?
Corruption definitely plays a role. However, I don't believe that that's the main, or if the role is played, especially in the West, it's far lower, far unimportant, let's say, to the whole issue of the inflation. For example, the central bank technically is independent institution, but I don't believe that anyone buys that. When you look at, for example, COVID is a really good, COVID crisis is a really good example, because what did the politicians offer were solutions and spending and everything that I personally would disagree. And all of the people like that. So I don't. Yes, maybe a lot of politicians and people close to the politicians have stolen some of the money, however much that is. But the big problem was the initial spending, overspending of what we don't have, and at the same time that the people were in favor of the spending. And yes, there is, as I say, fiscal policy and monetary policy are connected, and I don't believe in, again, it's only on paper independence of the central bank. So I would say corruption played a very little role, especially in this crisis.
Perhaps it would add to the answers that if we are thinking about corruption as the creation of rents, as the continuous creation of rents, these are unavoidably reflecting in inflation as well. Do you have more questions?
Yeah, I had two questions, but I'm going to unite them into one question. And my question is
Just
going
speak louder,
to go
louder.
And my question is going to go to Mr. Simon because he mentioned it in his speech. He talked about inflation and he also talked about the role of the private sector. So my question to him would be that why does the government not just use contractionary monetary policy to solve all this issue? And if the government decide not to use those policies to solve this issue, or do you think that the private sector is not going to bring the world into a free market economy? And we all know that, yes, it is true that at some point there is what we call in economies the free hand that is going to stabilize everything, but at the end of the day, we still have some advantages that are going to happen if the private sector is the only one to handle such crises. So from your perspective, because you said we should let the private sector do that, what do you think is going to happen?
First, I think that we are doing this monetary policy that we are not contracting. Technically, the US did like last week, but on a small scale. Because it's politically unpopular, it will not get you votes, and that's it. I believe it's that simple. It's like shooting yourself in the leg. Even if you say, "Oh, we're gonna have a balanced budget," at this point, it's shooting yourself in the leg because no one will. Everybody wants more, and everybody wants free. What was technically the second part of the question? Why does the business sector? What was the second part? Sorry to interrupt you. I can hardly hear. What I get is why did how can the private sector solve this? Well, I don't know whether I'm getting your question correct. However, I will add.
Could you repeat?
Yeah, you got like part of it. So what I was saying was that at the end of the day, the private sector is. If we just go towards that side, it's going to be a free market economy. And in a free market economy, we all know why the world decided not to be in just that kind of economy, because it has some disadvantages. So do you really think that us allowing the private sector to fully help us with the economic crisis that is going, because it has started, yes, but it's going to be worse if things are not solved, can be the best solution? Because you said we should allow them.
I would, if I had like a magic wand, I would just let the crisis unfold and wait for the correction. And after the correction happens, stop printing money and just let the money, printing money follows like the need of money in a sense. I would, we really, Keynes said on the long run we are all dead, and he's correct on that part, but at the same time we all have children and etc. So when we say, for example, with green energy, we are saying, oh, what are we leaving to, what kind of a planet are we leaving to the children? But when it comes to economics on the long run, we are all dead. So yes, we need the correction, as painful as it will be, because unless we do that, and we have not been doing that, especially in the 2008 and again in COVID, we are just making space for even bigger recession and bigger recession. And when that bigger recession comes, there will be no answers, and that is the big problem. And if to go back to like the core of the question, yes, I do believe that allowing the free market to work as freely as possible, we will see the efficiency coming from the invisible hand. Yes, I might not like, I don't know, 5 new burger places, but if the population of the city do like those 5 new burger places, that is the efficient model and expand this to the green energy or fossil fuel use is the same concept if the population values whatever, which one of those, even if I don't, the most efficient way in the market will work out. So that's the answer. I would, if I understand the question correctly. Sorry.
Just to challenge the premise that we all know what happens when the free market takes over. I don't know because I've never seen it. So I haven't seen a case where there was a really free market in one area and it really failed. So first I want to challenge this. And the second one to say is, I don't believe in the free market or in any free hand, visible hand, whatever. I believe in people acting and solving my problems voluntarily. I like going to people and say, hey, I give you my hand, do you want to deal with me? If they don't, then I don't expect that someone will use force against them to actually make this transaction happen, which is the essence of whatever is not the free market. So I don't believe in markets. I believe in people who are free to interact, and I believe that when we use our minds and we're free to do so, things are going to be much better because there's no other way to live humanely. Violence and coercion is not the way, and it never, quote, works. Again, the moral is the practical. If coercing people is not a good thing, which is not, then it's not going to work, and it never has.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. We are going to close now our second session, the Free Market Roadshow. But just think about how rare such free market ideas are being expressed in this building, right? Think about this thoroughly, and let's hope we'll have a chance to see you again next year on the same event. I thank very much our speakers for all their contributions, the organizers, and especially Alexandru Butisiacă, who brought us all together in this initiative. Thank you very much for your patience, for coming, and for staying with us. And let me wish you all enjoy lots of freedom and prosperity, right?